So I would like to welcome you to our episode 2 of Economy Unravelled. And today we delve into the pivotal development in the realm of global governance, which we all know is the recent inclusion of the African Union as a permanent member of the G20. And this move definitely has far-reaching implications for international trade, economic diplomacy, and global relations in general. So to discuss this in more detail, we have Ms. Jill with us, who's a distinguished expert in international trade policy and law. And before I begin the conversation, I would just like to give a brief introduction about you, ma'am, to the viewers who will later be listening to this podcast. Um, Ms. Jill holds an advanced degree in law, international humanitarian law, human rights, and international trade policy. And with more than 12 years of experience, ma'am has engaged in negotiations, research, and implementation of international trade agreements across Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. She's played a pivotal role in negotiating and providing technical assistance to developing countries while collaborating with EU, Canada, ASEAN, and other such entities. And her extensive contributions include work with organizations such as the Commonwealth Secretariat and her current role as the sub-regional trade advisor in Vanuatu. We look forward to your valuable insights on this topic today, ma'am. So I think we can begin if you're all right with that.
Thank you, esteemed. Just a kind or slight caveat. This is an interview that I'll be taking in my personal capacity. And therefore, the views that are given in this interview are views from my own expert opinion and my own analysis over the years, and they do not represent in any way whatsoever the opinions or objectives of any organization that I may be affiliated to. So I just think it's important I put that as a caveat so that we can be able to speak freely without fear or favor or without aligning ourselves to a certain institution or an organization, but rather aligning ourselves to the experience that we have gained through our educational backgrounds and, of course, through our career progression by the grace of God. Thank you.
Right, ma'am. Before we start talking about the African Union and its impact, I would like to ask your opinion on the G20 summit this year. How do you think it has fared in terms of productivity?
Thank you. First of all, I think I've not been an avid follower of the G20 meetings, but distinctively for the year 2023, this has been a historic meeting. It has been a meeting that once again has placed India as a pedestal, and I say it because India is a country dear to my heart. Having worked with India, I understand the passion India has always advocated for when it comes to advancing South-South cooperation and regional integration. So in my view, I think vouching for the African Union to sit in not as an observer anymore, or not as an international observer as was previously known, but now as a permanent member, goes a long way in seeing the value India has placed in the continent. And it also reflects our historic ties with India. India is a member of the Commonwealth. Most African countries are members of the Commonwealth, and there have been historic ties in the nation building of various African countries, Kenya being one of them, the country I come from. And so the prevailing, or rather the glaring outcome that I would find commendable in this G20 was India's commitment to ensure that we have Africa sit on board and have an equal voice on this table of global development. And it goes to say that India has set the pace of not just being a talker in terms of international development issues, but being a practitioner of what they say. And for that, a big congratulations and a big appreciation to the nation of India through your Honorable Prime Minister for this move. Thank you.
Definitely. And ma'am, would you then say that maybe the Indian presidency this year in G20 had a significant role to play in the fact that India was able to advocate for this move?
Yes, the Indian presidency, without a shadow of doubt, has played a role because I think there have been other prime ministers of India. Maybe they've discussed about it, but I think it goes into memoirs that Honorable Narendra Modi is the first Indian prime minister to recognize the importance of Africa, sitting in that global faction and having an equal voice like all partners. I mean, it would be. I found it on a personal view a bit tilted to have the EU sitting as a G20 member with the 27 countries. And then Africa is sitting as an international organization. Africa can never be an international organization. Africa is a continent that comprises 50 plus countries. And you cannot ignore Africa. We're in a dispensation right now where Africa cannot be ignored. You see, we are no longer in that historical purview where we were receiving. We are now more of global givers and global movers, and it's about time the rest of the world begins to see Africa with the lens India did. And I can tell you without a shadow of doubt, this has made a great impact and a true meaning to South-South cooperation. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Definitely, I agree with that. So, ma'am, what do you think will be the economic and geopolitical implications of the African Union's full membership in the G20?
So with that, thank you. I believe now there'll be stronger ties, trade ties. We are all aware that Africa is now embarking on a continental free trade area. Just a minute, just a second, 1 minute. Sorry for that. So I was saying Africa is in the process of now coming into a fully fledged free trade area. And with that in mind, India coming on board, or India advocating for Africa to sit in this big platform would mean, loosely speaking, greater economic ties, because trade is not only about comparative advantage, but also is about geopolitical placement. And now looking at India's goodwill with Africa in this context, I foresee more trade between India and Africa, especially in the area of trade in services, because as we know, the continental free trade area is coming on strong on investment and also services. You know, the world is now not aligning itself on trade in goods only, but equally trade in services, because that is where the niche is. That is where the industrialization development component is found. And so I see India coming up as a strategic partner on economic development for Africa, particularly in the area of factor production, the area of forward and backward linkages, the area of value chain development. India has got a very robust agriculture sector. And when I was working in India, I admired what I used to read referred to as the Panchayat system, a chiefly system that is used in managing trade and development. That's a very new concept, and it's a concept I believe that can work for Africa, because these are similar geopolitical systems. In Africa, we also have chiefly systems. We have, like in my country, Kenya, we have a devolution system, we have governance. So looking at the Indian model of trade, one thing I've observed about India is India is very strong on bilateral trade arrangements, bilateral free trade areas, or plurilateral free trade areas. And so I foresee a situation where not very long we'll have a regional comprehensive economic partnership between India and the African Union, just like what we are seeing India is having with the ASEAN states. So I foresee stronger trade and economic ties On the issue of climate change commitments, I also foresee a situation where now there'll be a unified approach in terms of climate mitigation. Right now, as we are speaking, most of our leaders are in the COP28 in Dubai, and I look at a situation where possibly there'll be an India or Asia Africa climate resilient facility where both nations will come together and look at how best to mitigate their climatic issues in a tailored manner. You see, there is what we are being told globally, but globally is where I believe when we are working on policies, we have to look at policies from a bottom-up approach. So this is what the global standard is, but we have to work our way from the bottom coming up. And that can come in when we have our own tailor-made policies that are aimed at climate mitigation and environmental friendly trading. That's an area I see coming on strong. In sectors such as education and health, this is also an area I see stronger synergies between India and Africa because of this gesture. And also policy making. I know India has one of the best precedents when it comes to issues as trade negotiations. I talk in my capacity as a trade policy expert and a trade negotiator. India has one of the best approaches when it comes to trade negotiations. I've seen how they do it, and this is one thing that we need to learn and emulate, and this kind of advocacy has put Africa and India at a stronger position. Thank you.
You talked about climate change. So in that capacity, I would want to know what role do you think the inclusion of the African Union would then help in addressing problems of sustainable development and perhaps even creating more sustainable supply chains?
Like I said, I see Africa has been committed. If you have been following some of the discussions that have been going on at the African Development Bank, at the African Export and Import Bank, there have been various conferences where the commitment to climate mitigation has been strongly advocated for. And so in this situation, I see a stronger alliance coming between India and Africa through the African Union. And like I said, we need a lot of climate finance, climate resilient facilities, which would help also enable our traders, especially the micro, small, and medium enterprises, align themselves to the global climate commitments. You realize there are certain products now, if you export to certain nations, sometimes they are denied market entry or market access, if you like, because they have not made a certain environmental commitment. And now with this kind of partnership, looking at the technological advancement India has, looking at the commitment on digitalization, I see a situation where there could be a synergy between the African Union and India and maybe other partners that are allies to India, coming up with an Asia-Africa resilient facility that is aimed at boosting our MSMEs so that the products that are being exported, not only are we going to be exporting, but we're also boosting their value chain so that we see an MSME rising from trading not only within the national confinement of where they are based, but regionally and even internationally. And now with an India or an Asia-Africa resilient facility or a resilient fund, we see a situation where we are now we'll be boosting our young entrepreneurs, our upcoming entrepreneurs to align themselves to these global climate obligations and trade sustainably, to put it simply. Thank you.
Ma'am, so in terms of now talking about international trade, how do you see this inclusion in African Union's inclusion in G20 impacting international trade negotiations and agreements?
Well, definitely, thank you. There'll be a geopolitical shift because every member has its allies. But I note that also in the G20, we have the European Union sitting in that platform. And European Union is one of the biggest trading partners for Africa. We know that through the economic partnership agreements that involves Africa, Caribbean, and the Pacific, I see a stronger trade ties between Africa and the European Union. I see the EPAs going beyond what we know them to be. And we have an upper hand because recently, 3 or 2 weeks ago, we just signed the Samoa Agreement. That's the new agreement that has taken up the Cotonou Partnership Agreement, noting that the Cotonou Partnership Agreement had a time frame of 20 years, which elapsed in 2018, and there has been negotiations, and finally, the new arrangement was signed in Samoa last 2 weeks, not last year. And this is now another bolster for Africa because through this and adding Africa sitting in the G20, I see now Europe having stronger ties with Africa. And not only Europe, within the G20, we also have other partners such as Brazil. We have partners such as Canada, Japan. So we are seeing stronger trade and economic ties coming because through this, we'll be able now to showcase this is what Africa has. This is what Africa produces. This is the comparative advantage that Africa has. So definitely, I'm seeing increased trade. I'm seeing a shift in the geopolitics because, hey, we have a whole continent comprising of 54 members sitting. So everyone would want to have an interest. So I see trade expanding. I see a lot of industrialization taking place when you're looking at the likes of Brazil sitting on board, the likes of Japan. I look at Africa in the next 5 years as one of the biggest powerhouses, courtesy of sitting in the G20. Thank you.
Definitely. So, ma'am, given the current global trade tensions, and I would say some global trade tensions remain constant, how might the African Union's participation in the G20 contribute to resolving some trade disputes and promoting fair trade practices?
Sorry, say that again.
Ma'am, how do you think the African Union would be able to contribute to helping resolve trade disputes or promoting fair trade practices?
I look at it like now there'll be wider markets. We have Africa now on the table, so your market is now expanded, and that could be a neutralizing factor, you see, and that would also extend more partnerships. There's always the fear of dominance by one member. I know there's always been discussion of the coming up of China as one of the economic giants. China is an ally to Africa. I think many countries in Africa have good economic ties with China. And so I see a situation where Africa will now play that mediative, if I'm to use that word loosely, because it's coming on board. And so nobody will have to feel threatened by another because the markets have extended. In terms of trade dispute resolution, what we have been advocating for, and I speak in my capacity as a trade expert for Africa or from Africa, we know that trade disputes is where many developing countries have been disadvantaged. If you look at the structure, particularly of the dispute settlement body in the WTO, we know that most cases are emanating from developed countries. And so I'm looking at a situation that Africa is now a powerhouse because this is a platform where the members control the vast majority of global GDP. And I feel that this now will give Africa visibility in setting its jurisprudence, and rightfully so, on trade issues. And it's even being accentuated further because we now have a continental free trade area that has various protocols that are still in the process of being concluded, and some are in the process of being implemented. And with the African continental free trade area, what we are saying loudly is Africa can also set its trade jurisprudence. And the G20 will be that platform that will give Africa that visibility, Africa playing a mediative role in terms of neutralizing the so-called powers that seem to interfere. And at the same time, Africa coming up with its own jurisprudence that is recognized when it comes to setting customary trade policy and also resolving trade disputes. Thank you.
How do you think that now that G20 is, membership is expanded, do you think this will be helpful for them in terms of, trying to tackle challenges posed by resource scarcity?
Sorry, I missed that again. Sorry.
Ma'am, do you believe that now that the African Union is part of the G20, it will help them address challenges posed by resource scarcity in terms of international trade?
Yes, like I said earlier, we now have a voice to speak out. We have that visibility. We also have issues we'll be presenting on the table that many partners may not be aware of. Okay, there are a lot of underpinnings that affect Africa trade. And I believe when we're looking, I'm talking from a trade perspective, but there's also Africa trade, Africa climate change policies. There are a lot of underpinnings that go with that. And it is my strong belief that having Africa on board would now create more exposure to those issues. And it will also enable the world to have a balanced voice on issues, because you realize when you're looking at trade, sometimes you only hear the voice from a certain group of members, maybe developed members. But now we are looking at Africa coming on board. India has been very strong, even in the WTO. And now with Africa on board, I see a stronger Africa, especially in the upcoming MC13 next year, the 13th WTO ministerial. I see Africa having a stronger voice because of this kind of elevation. And like I said, when I saw this announcement, I kept up my personal tweet and I said, I look forward to also India pushing for the Pacific to sit also as a member in the G20. And together we can have a stronger voice in that platform. So this is a game changer for us. And I see a different 13th WTO ministerial courtesy of this new development. Thank you.
I wanted to ask, what do you think in terms of G20 now having to work towards food and energy security? Do you think the African Union would now have a greater role to play in this?
Yes, like I said, some of these, there are issues you'll only know when you bring the partner on board. There are things Africa has that would be beneficial to India, that would be beneficial to Canada, Brazil, the EU. And that can only happen when you give it a voice. So I concur with you that in terms of issues of energy, food security, climate change, these are now burning issues the world over. Trade and economic governance. And let's also not forget women and youth development. I feel that Africa coming on board, it will be an opportunity, it will be an eye-opener, and maybe it will also be that opportunity where a lot of misconceptions will be disabused, because many members will get to know more, because sometimes we know about Africa at a very high level political scale, but now you're having Africa on board discussing in these policy meetings. It will enable members to appreciate looking at energy, food security, climate change, trade with another different lens. Because sometimes we look at it with one direction, But when you bring diversity like Africa and I dare add in future Pacific, then you begin looking at trade and other global issues with a holistic lens. So yes, I concur with you.
Ma'am, right now when you were having a conversation with the sir, you talked about connectivity being a problem for small island nations. So, in this context, I wanted to ask with respect to African nations, do you think now this development would also, benefit in improving connectivity with the African nations?
Yes, most of the members who are sitting in the G20 have very good connectivity strategies. If you look at China, if you look at Brazil, I think Brazil is a member. Let me just cross-check. If you look at Japan, they have robust connectivity strategies or systems in place. And I would take us back a little to the COVID era. When there was COVID, we all are aware that borders were closed, and borders were closed meant there was limitation in movement, and that had a strong impact on trade, especially for developing countries, Africa included. And so at that time, I think there was a lot of advocacy for e-commerce, pushing into digitization as an alternative to maintaining or increasing or sustaining international trade. And I know India has been big on digital economy. India has been big on e-commerce, and Africa sitting in this platform, I believe there'll be a lot of improvement on its connectivity. Of course, the road networks will improve. I see more bilateral air service agreements happening, and that would mean ease of transportation to different parts of the world. I see situations where we'll have bilateral air service agreements with Mexico, with China, with Japan, different countries, and we'll be having direct connections based on this. And I also see e-commerce. I see a lot of e-commerce platforms coming up, and a lot of trade, particularly for the MSMEs, being showcased globally. So yes, digital connectivity is going to highly and greatly improve. And also the physical infrastructure, the road networks, the maritime networks, port management, airports, airlines, bilateral air services agreements, and even manufacturing of automobiles. Some of these countries that are featuring here, they have their own manufacturing farms, and we are looking at industrialization. There's a whole concept of the African Union on industrialization, and this is one of the areas we are looking forward to seeing more factories, more job creation, and more factor production. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. And finally, I want to ask you, what are the potential challenges that you see that might arise for both the African Union as well as the G20 countries from this development?
The immediate thing I foresee is dealing with the multiplicity of regional economic commitments or regional economic treaties, or if you like, regional economic communities or blocks. Africa Union is comprised of 50 plus countries, and each of them belong to an economic bloc. We have those who belong to the East African Community. We have those belonging to COMESA. We have those in ECOWAS. We have those in CIMAC. We have those in the Arab League. And the list goes on and on. So the biggest issue would now be harmonization, okay? Because we know that there's been the renowned theory that has always been advanced by Professor Bagwati on the spaghetti ball effect of regional economic communities. But I always say that if managed well, if you are able to manage well and prioritize your interests well, then a country can belong to as many partnerships or regional economic communities as it wants. It doesn't affect anything, but you need to reorganize yourself. So I also see that situation coming up where we need to really think through how we'll harmonize a lot of things, particularly from the regional economic bloc front, because we are coming in as a bloc that has many sub-blocks or many building blocks. So these are issues that would need to be discussed, and interests need to be harmonized so that one member does not feel undermined or overlooked because of another member, or we don't get into a situation where there is a diversion of trade because of an interest that has been created due to this new development. So yes, harmonization would be key. Regulatory harmonization, both at our national levels, the different governments, the regional systems, and also the continental system. So that's what has been agreed upon politically, but there'll be a lot of work on the ground from the policy people, from the technocrat level, to ensure that political goodwill stands the test of time. Thank you.
That was all that I wanted to ask you, ma'am. But if you have any concluding thoughts or anything else that you would want to talk about.
Thank you. I once again want to, with deep appreciation, commend the government of India through the leadership of the Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi for considering, not only considering, but vouching for Africa to be graduated not just as an international organization, but a bona fide member to sit as an equal partner in the G20. And this just goes to say that South-South cooperation cannot be avoided. It goes to say that if we are talking integration, if we are talking genuine partnerships, if we are talking extending increased trade and economic development, then we always have to remember whether the party is a developing, least developing nation, it sits in that table as an equal partner. And this has been demonstrated truly, because Africa is an ally of all these members in the G20 and in various formats. And it is my hope and my humble request in my personal capacity to request India once again in collaboration with Africa, to consider including also the Pacific as a member of the G20. This way, we are going to be genuine about South-South cooperation and wider and deeper integration. That is my parting shot. And with that, I want to say thank you for this opportunity to give my views. And it is my hope that we will see the G20 grow and make the impact required by the grace of God. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And thank you for taking out the time to join us and talk about this. Your inputs have been very valuable. And I'm really looking at this very positively. And I think this development will go a long way.
I was just taking a screenshot of us.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. And it is my hope that we'll have more of these interactions going forward.
Definitely, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bless you.